So what I'm addressing today is a topic that would have been addressed next week, so you're getting it a week in advance. But it's basically called planning to action, moving from planning to action. Planning is a mental phenomenon. Action is more of an effect. So when we do something, that's an effect. So it's how do we move from planning to action? That's the nature of it. And it's all within the context of the creative mind, or the mind of the subconscious, the mind of the law. And what I want to do with this talk is to try to explain some practical applications of the Trinity. And that means looking at the interactions between planning, between action, and between the creative mind, how those interact to really solve most of the problems we have in a general way. As a lot of times when we get stuck in duality and there's what appears to be just a conflict, we don't know our way around it. But the way around it is always to bring in a third force or a third perspective. That third perspective often is to the creative mind, but we sort of just get stuck in our positions and we don't know what to do. It's almost like sometimes if I'm in a box and someone I'm communicating with is in a box and we're at loggerheads and we both stay in our box, there ain't no solution. But if we both agree to step out of our boxes, there's a solution in the ethers that we can, that will settle the conflict. And so that's the general way, general context. Now, prayer, as it turns out, prayer is a form of planning. When we pray, we're actually planning for something. And the greatest prayer is really the Lord's Prayer. And so I'm going to use that as a starting point. So when the simplified version of the Lord's Prayer is where Jesus says, ask and it is given. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door shall be open. Now what's interesting is he didn't say seek and maybe you'll find. He didn't say ask and I'll think about giving it to you. He didn't say knock and maybe the door will be open. He said seek and you'll find, and ask and it'll be given, knock and the door shall be open. So it turns out that seeking, asking, and knocking, I like to think of it as one little word, ask. That's a reminder. The word ask has all of those in there. Ask, seek, and knock. But that's a form of prayer, it's a form of planning. And the action part deals with what's given. When the door is open, that's what's given to us. That's the effect. That's the form that our prayer actually takes. And the creative mind, the law, has all the possibilities of what's going to manifest, but it doesn't have the plan till we give it the plan. It doesn't have the prayer till we give it the prayer. It has all the possibilities of how it's going to answer it, but we have to do our part and ask for it. The more clear our asking is, the more clear our result will be. Ernest Holmes says in How to Use the Science of Mind that if our words and our plans, if they are aligned with the law, then the manifestation is going to take place according to kind of what we want. That's not always the case. A lot of times stuff that shows up in our life is not what we want, even though on some level it wouldn't have showed up if we didn't want it on some level. Now there's two parts of this to talk technically is just about two parts of the Trinity, but because it's within the context of the creative mind, I'm bringing in the third part. And so the two faces of the Trinity, or the two faces of God, Reverend Carolyn talked about the two faces last time. One face in this talk is planning, the other face is action. So to plan something literally means to think it out, to contemplate it, to prepare in advance. That's the conscious mind, and we talk about that in our model of science of mind. So the planning and contemplating is the conscious mind. Actually doing something, accomplishing something, some actual movement is the result. And it's the law of manifestation fulfills or completes the action and the plan. But that third factor, in this case, is the creative mind. That fulfills the law. And there's many, many ways that it does that, as we'll see in a second. Now there's a contradiction, as I kind of alluded to, between what we want and what we get. We don't always get what we want. And usually in my life, and I think this is true in just about everybody's life, if I expect something and I want something, and the thing I get is much less than what I want, I'm not a happy camper. If I expect something, I want something, what I get is equivalent, hey, I'm happy. If it's even greater, I'm elated. But when it's less than what I want, if I want something that's a 10 on a 10-point scale, meaning 10 is the tops, and I get a 2 or 3, I'm generally kind of not so happy. Why does that happen? Well, it happens when our thoughts aren't aligned with the creative mind. And that just sort of shows up. Now, this thing of the Trinity can even be called the law of three. The law of three settles the law of two. The law of two is duality. And technically, it's separation. When we have separation duality, there's no way to integrate them. And so let's talk about how. So the way you resolve that conflict is that both people have to be willing to give up their positions. Now, maybe one person can give up their position and you can get something resolved. But if it just stays a duality, what's going to happen is, let's say it's male and female. If it just stays male and female, or masculine and feminine, the masculine will dominate much of the time, and the feminine maybe agrees. But not all the time. Sometimes the feminine dominates and the masculine goes along with it. But in general, when you have two opposing sides, they can rarely come up with an acceptable agreement. They may come up with a compromise, or they may come up with something that's that one side has most of the power and the other side is just a subservient one. But that's the way duality sort of works. It's sort of one-sided. Now let me share another example of the Trinity, which is pretty popular. We've all heard of this kind of holistic healing where we say mind, body, spirit. I'll just use the term mind, body, soul. If we want to integrate mind, body, and soul in our healing of people, or healing of situations, because that brings into, that they don't use the word Trinity, but when we're thinking about healing the mind, healing the body, healing the soul, that's what's called holistic healing. Now, what happens if we have a situation where there's a conflict between the soul and the mind? The two don't agree. The soul seems to say something, meaning that your intuition is telling you something, but your head is telling you something different. How do you resolve that conflict? Your head is saying, everything I can think of says go this way, but my intuition is saying go that way. How do I put the two together? Well, that's where in some ways you just have a gut feeling. You just sit with it, and what does your feeling say in that case? That's like coming from a third perspective. That may be what the answer is listening to what your gut feeling says. Almost always in my case, when there's a conflict, I tend to go to the soul. I tend to try to do a little reading or that way. But sometimes you can just sit and say, okay, there's a conflict between what my head is saying and what my intuition is saying. How does it feel? And that's a third force. So that could be the Trinity. Sometimes there's a conflict between the mind and the body. It could show up where and the way that might show up is, what do you do if you have a thought about something and a feeling about something? How do you resolve it? I feel this way, but I think that way. One of my teachers, Howard Thurman, used to say, if you have to choose between how I think and how I feel, what do you choose?
Feeling.
And some people will say feeling, others will say thinking. Now, which one is right? Well, if you have a conflict, how do you resolve the conflict? Well, I would say the conflict between feeling and thinking is the soul. It's the higher mind. It's go to visioning. Now, many times it would just be, I'm a thinking person, I'm a scientist, I'm rational, I'm going with the thinking. Other people would say, I always have good experience with my gut, with my feelings. I'm going with my feelings. He didn't answer the question. He just said, if you have to choose, how do you answer? And he just let it hang out there. And people had to sort of think about that. And a lot of people would say, go with my feelings, because that's a heavy thing. But other people would say, everything you feel comes out of a thought first. First you think something, and it trickles into your feelings, and your feelings are there, but your thoughts usually precede them ultimately, kind of thing. But that's